Hi, everyone. I wanted to introduce the topic of how we read moving images by focusing on a scene from one of the most revered of all American movies, Citizen Kane, directed by Orson Welles in 1941. We're going to focus on one particular scene from this film, which has to do with the main character's childhood, and I'll go into that in some detail in a minute. But I wanted to focus on two elements of composition. One is framing, which is to say the way in which frames are used to offset or give emphasis or draw attention to particular objects within the on the screen, and the other is the blocking of characters, the relative position of the actors to each other. But first, a little background. Citizen Kane is the story of Charles Foster Kane, a megalomaniacal newspaper tycoon and master of media and media manipulation, who's loosely based on an historical character, William Randolph Hearst. If you haven't heard of Hearst, probably the best contemporary equivalent would be someone like Rupert Murdoch. In fact, there is no one like Rupert Murdoch. A character who craves the adoration of the public. He demands absolute loyalty from all the people around him, and he eventually drives them all away out of an overabundance of demand, essentially. The film begins with the moment of Kane's death, essentially, which is something that we'll see reiterated throughout the course of the movie. It is a very sort of cryptic scene. He's lying in his bed, he's alone at home. He's holding a snow globe with the image of a little winter cabin in it. He drops the globe as he utters the word rosebud, which is supposed to have some sort of uh, significance in the story, and we'll talk about why it is significant as we move along. Then we move to the sort of second beginning of the narrative, which is a group of journalists putting together a newsreel telling the story of the life of Charles Foster Kane. This is the section referred to as News on the March. They're looking at the footage. It's about 5 or 6 minutes of a summary of the 80 years of his life, from essentially his birth in poverty in Colorado to his heyday and then his eventual fall, etc. And they're sort of discussing problems that arise out of this, in particular, the rumor of this notion of rosebud, right? So the journalists are sort of standing around in the screening room and they're discussing what is this rosebud? And they're imagining it somehow or other to be a missing piece from some larger puzzle. So one of the journalists is given the job of researching rosebud. The story of Kane is told through a series of interviews with friends, confidants, and one of Kane's ex wives, his second wife, Susan Alexander. Each of them tells similar stories, though there are details that conflict between the three of them. And each of them has a pretty different relationship with him that would give them different levels of intimacy, different levels of understanding, etc. Susan, who had been married to him for over a dozen years at the point that they were divorced, Jedediah, who's his best friend from his college days and continues to work for him. Jedediah is something of a hanger on to a certain extent and eventually offends Kane and is fired. And probably his most sort of loyal minion, I suppose, his business manager, Mr. Bernstein, who, from what we can tell from the film, they're still on relatively good terms at the point when Kane dies, but they're not in business with each other anymore. The other bit of testimony that we get isn't actually in the form of an interview, but a memoir written by Walker Parks Thatcher, an investment banker from New York who serves as guardian to Charles Foster Kane for most of his life. In fact, from about the age of 9 upwards until he turns 21 and gains his financial independence. And we're going to talk about Thatcher after we've screened this particular scene, but he's an incredibly important figure in this story for a number of reasons. One is that he's not there to speak for himself. Two is that his memoir is the only record that we have of any events in Charles's past, so we rely very heavily on him for background information. And three, within that memoir and within that moment recorded in the film is the key, presumably, to understanding what Rosebud is about. At this point, I'm going to pause for a minute to allow you an opportunity to screen that scene along with your instructor. And when you've had a chance to do so, you can unpause and we'll move on and talk about that scene. As you watch, I would ask you to focus on two things. Number one, what's going on in the scene? And number two, where are the characters in relation to the camera? And we'll talk about that when we return. So this is a scene in 3 shots, actually. The first of them is an establishing shot where we see young Charlie playing out in the snow outside of his mother's boarding house, and which is famously announced by the sign that he throws the snowball at. By establishing shot, we mean it essentially sets the location. We know where we are. But this is going to become a very important point of reference when we get to the third shot, because of these 3, 2 of them are exterior views, which include Charlie's point of view. But the longest part of the narrative, or the longest part of the scene, I should say, is an interior view, which we'll be talking about next. The interior scene is actually shot in a very creative way, especially considering the time in which it was made. It's actually a crane shot through the window. So it starts outdoors, it snakes in through the window, and it finds itself eventually at the back wall of the cabin with the 3 characters as actually there are 4 because we see Charlie outside the window, framed as we see now. But this is actually one long unbroken shot. It starts from outside, it moves in through the window, and then it settles there. This is a remarkably complex shot to set up. There's a grand sweep to it from exterior to interior, all in one motion. Notice, by the way, how the interior space is framed here. In fact, it's 3 frames. And the very, well, it's not centered here, but through much of the shot it is centered. Toward the center of it, we see Charlie framed actually within the window frame. And then we see Charlie's dad in the mid-background, or mid-ground, I suppose is more accurate, framed by the post and beam of the building itself, right? So there's a barrier, a partial barrier wall against which Thatcher and the mother sit. And as we move forward into the foreground and into the extreme foreground, we see the other 2 parties who are framed by the cinematic frame itself. So we have 3 frames sort of nesting inside of each other here. Now, what's important in this image, in this composition, actually there are several things that are important about it. One is hierarchy, right? So in the extreme distance is Charlie. It's important to recognize that he is completely separated from this scene. At this point, the window is closed. He can't hear what's going on. We hear some shouting from him through the window. He's playing a sort of Civil War reenactment where he's pretending to be a Union soldier. He's talking about Andrew Jackson. There's all sorts of, this and that going on behind us. There's a kind of, it's a historical conflation, I suppose, in a sense. The father is in the middle ground, and he's sort of griping and complaining about the fact that he wasn't asked about the contracts that they're signing. He seems to have no authority whatsoever concerning what happens to the son. In the middle foreground is Thatcher. He's going through the contracts and describing what the expectations are, et cetera, et cetera. He's dotting the I's and crossing the T's. And then in the extreme foreground is the mother, who's sitting there very sternly, very stolidly, and going through this material with Thatcher to make sure that it's right. She is in the most dominant position. And here's the point I want to get at here. Within compositional logic, 2 things determine where our attention goes. The first of them is size. So the largest object tends to draw our attention. And this is particularly true of faces because the human eye is drawn first and foremost to the face. So the mother is visually dominating this space. And by the way, she will continue to do so throughout the entire sequence, even as she recedes into the back of the room as we cut to the 3rd shot in this scene. The second is volume. right? And volume can be the literal filling of space with an object, but more, colloquially, we think of volume as sound. She is the loudest voice in this scene as well. She's talking over other characters. She's asking questions, or she's uh, squashing commentary, or whatever the case may be. She's an incredibly powerful figure in this scene. I'm going to come back to why that's important in a second here. There is actually a third element of dominance, but since we're looking at a visual image, you can't really see it here. But if you go through the scene and you watch it again, movement is the other way that our eye is drawn. When an object is moving, our eye is drawn to it out of a kind of evolutionary survival mechanism. We want to make sure that something isn't coming at us, right? We just sort of have that natural attraction to moving objects. The order of distance is incredibly important here, but so are the voices. And I want to draw attention to that. The power arrangement within the room, from mother to Thatcher to father to son, is mirrored in the cacophony of voices. The mother and Thatcher are discussing the contract arrangements vigorously over the father, who's griping about being left out of the decision. That is, until he hears about the annual pension that he's going to receive, and suddenly he simmers down. Obviously, very cynical point here. Charlie is oblivious, doing his battle reenactment out in the snow, and we're simply observing him from a distance. Now, Orson Welles is famous for developing this style of overlapping dialogue as a way of showing how characters try to dominate and control each other. It's about interpersonal politics. And we certainly see that at play here. And it's going to become very important in a second when we start to think about what's actually happening in this scene. Up to this point, we've been watching four separate stories. Charlie's been playing outside on his own. The three adults have been inside, essentially debating what's going to happen, or at least somewhat in conflict with each other. There's a power struggle going on, to which Charlie is oblivious. In the third shot of this scene, we see those four stories come together. And they come together in the form of acts of coercion or explanation. In other words, trying to get Charlie to understand what's happening to him, and to a certain extent, trying to get him on board with it. Now, this is a very fraught scene for a lot of reasons. First of all, it's clear that Charlie has not been informed about what's going on. Second of all, it's unclear as to how he feels about it. He doesn't, for example, reach out to his mother for comfort. He asks his father for some clarification, and even as his father crouches down and looks as though he's going to give him a hug and comfort him in some way or other, Charlie seems merely quizzical about it. In fact, the only sort of emotion that we see Charlie express in this particular shot is anger, and it's anger toward Thatcher, who tries to take his sled away from him. Now, there's a big reveal in this scene. We're 20 minutes into a 2-hour movie at this point, and we actually do find out what Rosebud is, which we'll get to in a second. But much more importantly than that is that we're seeing a kind of confluence, or really a dissolution to a certain extent, of what each of their sense of the story is. That Charlie is in a frustrated state here. Now, the reason why this is so important is because when we see what the big reveal is in this scene, we'll realize that this is actually the primal moment in Charlie's life, and that he will remember it as a traumatic one. And we're going to come back to that. Let's start with the reveal. So it turns out the rosebud that Charles Foster Kane utters as he's dying 80 years after this, or however long after it is the sled that he leaves behind when he's taken from his parents' home and goes off to New York to live with Thatcher for basically the rest of his life, or at least his life up into adulthood. Now, one would think 20 minutes into the movie, we have the big reveal. Okay, so what? Why bother? Why move on at all, right? But what exactly does Rosebud mean here? And why would it be a word that Kane utters at the point of his death? And that's really a question that a lot of film critics and sort of casual viewers of the film have been asking themselves since the movie first came out. What does this primal scene mean in Charlie's life is probably the better question, rather than trying to sort of determine what it means for us. It's the word that he cries out on his deathbed, so clearly it means something to him. At this point, we need to sort of make a separation between two points of view in this film, which is clearly identified in the scene that we've just seen. There is the Charlie view of things, which is the first and the last shot, where we're seeing things from his point of view. And then there's the sort of big picture view of things, which is those of us that are aware of what's going on inside the room have evidence to sort of figure out what exactly is going on. Because the film asks a series of questions in this scene. The first of them is, why does the mother send the son away? Now, there's a partial answer to this. She inherits some property from a boarder who was unable to pay. The property was considered to be worthless, but it turns out that there was a massive copper mine on it and a huge amount of wealth. In fact, enough to, keep any family comfortable for the rest of time. But she decides to give most of it to her son. Why does she do that? Okay, one easy answer to that, I suppose, is she wants a better life for him. But why not for all of them? Why don't they all take this money and move somewhere else and make a different life for themselves? Here's where things get a little trickier. What is the father so upset about, right? Why is he being excluded from this discussion? We get a couple of clues to this in the third shot of this scene. It turns out Dad is abusive. Now, it doesn't appear as though he's abusive toward Charlie, who isn't revulsed from him in any way. He doesn't shy from his touch. He's a little quizzical around him, but he certainly doesn't seem nervous or there aren't any indications of a battered child, which means that he's abusive toward the mother. And the goal of the mother here is to get the son out. So the big picture view, when we read it through that lens, is not so much Charlie's of here's this childhood trauma as here's a mother looking for a way for her son to get a lucky escape. From Charlie's point of view, he's being stripped of his childhood because he doesn't know the rest of this. And this is absolutely essential to understanding the film. The film is built entirely around the gap between these 2 points of view. What his mother sees as a miraculous liberation is for her son a deep trauma, a cold repudiation by the person from whom he most needs love. As elucidating the theme of this film, which is essentially about where do narcissistic megalomaniacs come from, this moment is absolutely essential to understanding it. In the context of the larger story of the film, it's not about lost childhood so much as what makes Charles so eager for power and adulation as an adult. It's about psychic damage and his attempt to repair it with money, with love, with celebrity, with the acquisition of things, and with the manipulation of others through the media and finally through politics. It's the story of the making of a narcissistic megalomaniac, as I said before. But it's also the story about where that road leads, which is to lovelessness, isolation, paranoia, and finally a grasping for what has been lost. Now, when we think about that center shot within that scene, it starts to make a little bit more sense. If this is a movie about gaps of perception and understanding and experience and, whatever it is that we're searching for, those things that are unreachable, Wells's decision to make literal separations between each of the characters, to isolate them each within their own little frames of reference and their own set of thoughts and fears and desires, and so on and so forth, is the clearest evocation of this idea of a gap. Gap between people, gap between perceptions, gap between what I want and what I need, etc., etc. The meaning of an object or a word is often simply in the way that we frame it. The journalist spends the entire film trying to discover the meaning of rosebud, and he never finds it. In fact, in one of the very last scenes of the film, we watch Rosebud the sled being burned among the other detritus of Kane's life in the aftermath of his death. The journalist doesn't see this happen. He doesn't dig it out. It's just another object in an enormous pile. But because Kane has spoken the word, and because our attention has been drawn to it as an object of importance, almost a talisman, we're driven towards it. We freight it with meaning. We determine that somehow or other it's a symbol of Kane's sense of loss of innocence, of Kane's trauma. It becomes the primal object in his life, when in fact it's just one among many other objects in his life. Maybe more important than others, but like any other piece of the puzzle, no more dominant in terms of determining what the larger picture is. The missing piece is only valued because of the gap that it leaves, not because of what it contains in order to fill out the picture. This is a movie about constructing and reifying those gaps, gaps of understanding, gaps of connection, etc., etc.